not actually put you on there.
Cool.
I'm going to go to your page and check.
Cool. Well, I'll say hello to everyone. We are troubleshooting as it stands. There's Barrett. I can see Barrett. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Hey. Okay, cool. Well, Claire, I'll hang up on you quickly, and hopefully that means our connection stays in place. Thank you for your help.
Yeah, no problem.
Cheers. Cool. Well, good to see you.
Garbage application. This live stream, this Kickstarter live stream thing. It's absolute garbage. Like it shakes. I mean, it's nightmarish to have to use this thing.
But we finally have you, so at least we got that far.
Was it worth the price we paid? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, like one of the things that we chatted about before was the idea of doing some stuff in Divinity Original Sin over Twitch. Maybe that was what we should have defaulted to in the first place.
We can build the whole thing in game in Divinity 2, yeah, and stream that. And just I could do avatar. And you could be that's good. That's not a bad idea. It's kind of interesting actually.
Next time. Well, yeah, I guess we say hello to everyone. I don't know. It doesn't look. I don't know how this thing works or whether it lets me know who's in. It doesn't actually look like we've got any viewers just yet. So let's.
We got 13. It says right here.
Oh right, okay. We got 13. It says 0 for me. So hopefully it's 13. And if we take an average, then it'll be 7.5 or 6.5. So hello to those of you out there watching this live stream. My name's Rich Metzen. I'm a software developer and a games developer primarily. I make a game called Off Grid, which you can see on all these lovely posters and bits and pieces in the background, which is a stealth hacking game about data privacy and mass surveillance. And with us today, we have Barrett Brown, who is an activist and journalist who has written and explored that world in incredible depth over the years and paid the penalty for it as well. So that's the interesting thing. I think it'd be good for us to kind of dig into a little bit eventually. But we'll start with a little intro from yourself, Barrett. Can you tell us about what you've been working on recently and the Pursuance Project?
Certainly. So 2 things, one of which is a book detailing the adventures that you referenced and goes into sort of what I did and what Anonymous did and what Anonymous is and what all these things mean. And then beyond that, also sort of somewhat tied to that, putting together something called the Pursuance Project, which is a framework for mass civic collaboration. It's basically an online visualized structure whereby participants who are invited in by existing participants can come in. Each of them, they all have the same ability to create and to customize these structures, these sort of almost sort of organisms of collaboration called pursuances. These little entities, and all these little entities exist together in this sort of ecosystem. And so, if you're trying to do something like setting up a campaign somewhere, or if you're trying to, bring in refurbished bikes to send to Africa, or anything ranging from philanthropy to what we might call technocratic politics, this can be used to very easily and fairly create structures for collaboration, including among people with no pre-existing relationships. So there's a lot of aspects to this. It's something that sort of comes out of 10 years of examining the way the internet and internet movements work, also examining the way institutions work and how they can work better, and sort of combining the solidity of an institution with the fluidity of a amorphous movement and trying to keep the best parts of both those things. And so the people can read about that at pursuanceproject.org, and we have a bunch of materials out there explaining the various facets. But that's the short rundown.
Cool. And so I guess the thing to ask next is, because Off Grid is a game that's kind of based or aimed at a much wider mainstream audience and trying to bring them into the sorts of things that you tackle in incredible depth. Some of the people watching might be from the games side of things or indie games fans and not actually be really all that well versed with this kind of stuff. So could you give a little history on where you came from in getting into this kind of thing? You were a journalist and kind of talk a little bit about your history, how you then ended up involved in hacktivism and how you then got to this place with Pursuance.
Certainly. So I was a journalist and freelancer for most of my 20s. And over time, I became more and more disenchanted with the protocols of journalism, the sort of just the ways in which these things are done, and the lack of effect it tends to have. Journalism. Without a engaged citizenry, you can investigate whatever you want, expose whatever you want, but there's not necessarily, there's just a very small diminishing returns on exposing things when the public just doesn't care or doesn't have the power to change those things. So I got more and more interested in activism, particularly when I saw Anonymous successfully using these new online structures to, for instance, 2008, to go after the Church of Scientology and run this very global, massive campaign. It sort of came out of nowhere. So I was obviously very interested in the ability to harness huge numbers of people with the same ideas or similar ideas and similar ideology around the world, and get them into working groups whereby they could self-organize into formidable structures. And so I started a group called Project PM, originally intended to develop some new sort of journalism frameworks, whereby for some of the more erudite blogs to better share information, better sort of form a cartel of sorts to encourage the mainstream outlets to focus on things they might otherwise disregard. That evolved into something else when I got involved with Anonymous during the Tunisian Revolution, which happened in early 2011. Anonymous happened to have a number of participants who were Tunisian nationals and were very active in that revolt against the dictatorship there, against the Ben Ali regime. And as I had kind of been writing about last year, I had expected these kind of things to happen for these dynamic groups like Anonymous to go after nation states and to start winning. And so that, finally came to pass. And so I started working with them. Not long after I got involved with Anonymous in February 2011, we had this bizarre altercation with a number of companies in the U.S. These are intelligence contracting firms mostly in the D.C. area or California that provide technology and services to governments, to other companies, and to each other. These are called intelligence contracting firms. They tend to be staffed with ex-intelligence staffers, ex-military people, ex-State Department people, etc. These particular firms, it turned out, after some of our people hacked them, turned out they were working on this very nefarious, very indefensible conspiracy against a bunch of left-wing activist groups in the U.S., against journalists, including Glenn Greenwald, against WikiLeaks, and against people who even donated to WikiLeaks at that point. They were doing this on behalf of Bank of America and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which both had their own reasons to go after all these various groups. This all got exposed. We suddenly had all these emails to and fro from these companies.
So this was H.B. Gary.
Yeah, this is H.B. Gary. Federal was the main sort of point of contact with the one that was actually raided. And the conspiracy I'm referring to, this Team Themis deal, that also consisted of Barrico, Endgame Systems, and most notably Palantir, which has become more and more prominent since then.
Yeah. They were kind of a small player when you first cracked that nut in some sense. I mean, obviously it was Peter Thiel, so there was a lot of money behind them, but they weren't what we know of as Palantir today. Yes,
so one of the most interesting and telling and I think frightening aspects of this is that even after we exposed this very indefensible project, which involved several just outright illegal activities. It involved hacking. It involved setting up activists on fraud charges. It involved disinformation across the board. Even after this came out, and even after it was a big media thing for about a month, there's a lot of coverage. There's calls for congressional investigation. That congressional investigation was shot down. Even after all of this, Peter Palantir didn't really take a hit on that. They apologized. They claimed falsely that this had only been one employee involved in the more nefarious stuff, that no one else knew about it. We have emails which we put out showing quite the contrary. The CARP, the president of the company, knew about it. The lead counsel knew about it, et cetera. Anyway, the fact that they were caught, which was, and it was very lucky that they were caught. It was sort of a one-off thing whereby Anonymous was going after this other company for some unrelated thing and just happened to stumble upon this. The odds of that happening were very low. Yeah. And so, there was very few consequences for those involved. In fact, some of those who were most directly involved became more prominent. were rewarded over time. The one guy at Palantir who was most heavily involved in the most nefarious things, Matthew Steckman, was later promoted. First he was put on leave, while they investigated, and then a few months later, when the press, as it does, shifted attention elsewhere, promoted him to another role. So these are things that we keep. And there were other hacks, and there's more activity over time in which we exposed other operations, other programs. Most importantly, which we'll talk about in a moment, persona management. Even through all this, it just never quite. What we've learned is that we're up against a very difficult, entrenched enemy. That even when it's exposed, and even when the implications are so clear, we just don't really get much. We're not really able to combat them through the normal avenues of press coverage and citizen engagement. And so that's the kind of thing that ultimately spurred me on to try to design better ways of harnessing people like us who do care about these things and are willing to think up new methods of combating them. Because we obviously we cannot rely on existing institutions to go after, things this entrenched, this intertwined with our governments and corporations. We just can't expect journalists to do a good enough job on this issue.
Yeah. So would you say that literally there has been no consequence since that stuff has broken? Although has the public knowledge of it at least had some kind of roll-on effect? Because I think in some sense you kind of in a way that Snowden opened up the dialogue around mass surveillance, you're kind of at the center of how people understand the notion of an industrial, an intelligence industrial complex nowadays. I think that's something that certainly I wouldn't have been able to coin as a phrase before hearing and reading some of the stuff that you've put out.
Right. We had Project PM, which as I alluded to earlier, was originally my group, and it later evolved into a crowdsourced investigation into these issues. We maintained a wiki. We went through these emails over the next year or so, just going through, finding new details, writing them up, giving them to the press, helping them understand these things. I continue to write about them for The Guardian, and all that. So, obviously, to some extent, there were some documentaries made, of course, about it as well. So it was now out there. We went from zero knowledge of this industry and the technologies involved to some knowledge, but it was never enough. It was never enough to have any real consequences. We set the ground such that there is now some journalists and some citizens around the world who understand these are important. And of course, the fact that the election has brought these same issues, including some of these same companies, back to the fore, has also helped. But there's so little putting two and two together among much of the press unless they have their hands held through it. And so we're going to be on an ongoing basis. We're going to have to continue to basically give them free tips, reiterate over and over again, like, hey, these companies we went after back in 2011, they've cropped up again in the election. And you guys understand the election was a big deal, right? So maybe it's time to stop forgetting about these companies 3 weeks after they get exposed and maintain actual steady attention on what they're doing and what this means. Palantir and Archimedes Global were two of the companies we went after back then. Both of those companies cropped up with Cambridge Analytica in their efforts with the Trump campaign and certain other actors to put out very specified, targeted propaganda throughout the U.S. Same thing happened with Brexit. We now know more about what these companies were doing in Yemen years ago. It's all the same sort of procedures, same methodologies, and they're still very little known. But anyone who wants to know about these things, they can. I don't remember the exact URL it's at now, but that website that we compiled over that year and a half or so is still up there. If you just look up Project PM, wiki, there's a lot there. There's a lot of things that even the press, at this point, they should know about. They should be examining, because these are technologies and methodologies and procedures this is not just some side issue. These are things that strike directly at information. These are propaganda techniques and methodologies that are hard to defend against, B, are all the more hard to defend against since very few people know what they are, C, are automated, semi-automated in some cases, as in a person who years ago as an intelligence officer or some lackey for a company would have had to sit there 12 hours a day writing stuff on the internet. Well, now they have software that can facilitate that, and as that software improves behind the scenes, with the support of the U.S. government and with the support of other governments abroad, that's a genie that's hard to put back in the bottle. Once the ability to mass produce disinformation exists, it will proliferate. Other governments will have it. Other actors will have it. And as time goes on, it's going to be more and more difficult to determine reality. And that's, I would have hoped, would have been something that as a republic or as a civilization, our leaders and sort of more well-known journalists would have perhaps dipped their feet into at some point. So is the idea with
sorry, got a bit of a sudden. Is the idea here with pursuance to there we go, that's the echo gone, to kind of provide a documentation in the same way as Project PM did in some sense, or is that's the collaboration part and the kind of historical documentation of these things, or the mapping out of these things occurs on other platforms or on other wikis in the way that Project PM
Pursuance can be used to do a lot of this, to do the same things we were doing in Project PM and any number of other things for that matter. But really the emphasis here is on action. It's on figuring out new ways of finding, identifying, bringing in, vetting, and organizing, self-organizing large numbers of people in a way that can whereby these groups can grow very quickly, exponentially, in fact, without being weighed down. So to answer your question more specifically, there are, Pursuance is sort of the platform for the planning, the organization, the deciding. Other platforms will still be necessary. For instance, you might have a collaborative document, on another platform. You'll still be wanting to use Twitter, for instance, to get messages out. It's not intended to replace any one thing. It's intended really more to fill a vacuum that exists right now of a secure, end-to-end encrypted, safe ecosystem for people to find each other easily and to proceed from there, while avoiding a lot of the frictions and the difficulties that we ran into. Occupy Wall Street, Anonymous, all these things where you have amorphous, sans charter, no sort of organizational style, all the friction that it develops whenever people with no pre-existing relationships come together and start having to decide, well, what is fair? Who gets to do this? This solves a lot of those problems by creating a procedure whereby everyone starts out, with the same equal rights to do whatever. And over time, they decide what they're comfortable with and who they want to work with and what that workflow will look like. And what, from there. So that's something we just didn't have. That was something that had to be kind of on an ad hoc basis, had to be improvised. And that itself, more than the infiltration, more than the opposition we got from governments and law enforcement agencies, that was the big problem with a lot of these movements 10 years ago, is that the manner in which we were doing it and the ad hoc mediums like Facebook and IRC with which we were necessarily, equipped, those were inherently, they were inherently bad mediums for these kind of things. So we just want to create a good medium that will amplify those kind of techniques.
And so, as me kind of trying to summarize that for the layman, in some sense, Pursuance is like a collaboration platform, more akin to a Google Drive for collaborating with other activists, in the sense that you kind of got different permissions you can give to different folders and different people, and then it's something that you can actually take a top-down view as to who you've given that responsibility to. Right.
And that's definitely an accurate way to look at it. Beyond that, I mean, it's part of the point of Pursuance from the very time I began planning it years and years ago was that it be very easy to visualize. So some pursuances, if they're high security, if they're doing very sensitive work, they will be opaque. They will not be visible to non-participants. But the majority of them, they're going to want to have their structure at least visible, because that's how organizations and groups, that allows them to see at a glance, because here's a group that's doing something similar to what we're doing. Here's how they're doing it. Here's how they're set up. Here's a possible area of alliance. Like here's a point at which we could probably help them and they could help us, and to make that, easily available. So groups that are doing more mundane work, it's stuff that's not going to, you're not being spied upon by 4 different agencies. They're going to want to take advantage of sort of the visualization aspect to some extent. The great thing about Pursuance beyond that is that, everyone can decide for themselves how secure it will be. What does it take to join your entity, your Pursuance? what are your rights upon joining? What do you get to see? All these things we're basically providing like tinker toys for structures and allowing the users, to experiment with those tinker toys as time goes on. You can think of it as a primordial soup, for civic engagements, where, all these different little organisms experiment and try things out and perhaps die, but others, that succeed, serve as a model for still others. One of the most important things about all this is that we have a sort of a central library whereby if someone comes in and creates this structure, and the structure, because of the way it's set up, because of the connections, because of who's answering to who or otherwise, it happens to work very well for some kind of practice. It could be, propaganda, information campaigns. It could be, something else. They then take a copy of it and submit it to the central library, annotate it, say, look, we built this, we're doing it for this project, it worked very well for this, it might work for this, this, and this as well. Here you go. Everyone who comes into Pursuance or is already there or whatever, looking to build structures, rather than have to reinvent the wheel, they're able to look through this whole library of different kinds of these sort of organisms, these sort of human organisms, and take it and modify it for their own ends, and then resubmit it. And so you have several layers of evolution occurring within Pursuance. Then you have the quantity. You have more people coming in, and thus providing a larger array of skills and services and knowledge and techniques and et cetera. And you also have this over time the refinement of Pursuances themselves, the increasingly refined basis for these structures. And so over time, Pursuance becomes more formidable. Even as it brings in more people, unlike something like Reddit, for instance. Reddit, is a great example because when it started out, early days, of course, the barrier to know about Reddit, the sort of most people were not aware of Reddit, obviously. If you knew about Reddit, most likely, not always, but most likely you were a certain kind of person, probably an early adapter, probably, interested in reading and writing. That sets you apart, obviously, from the population as a whole. And so you have a relatively erudite place. A place that's quickly becomes one of the best places to get information on current events on the entire internet, because you have articles being submitted by generally erudite people, and you have corrections, additions, comments being voted to the top, again also by relatively erudite people. Now over time, the barrier to know about Reddit decreases, and you have more people. These new people are not necessarily by any means lesser than the original users. In fact, many of them will be better, but on the whole, we do tend to see deterioration over time because that unique character of the early adapters, eventually sort of gets flooded with people who don't have those characteristics. Now, so I was thinking about this problem, and that's what kind of where Pursuance came from, is that how do we allow something to grow without us having to micromanage it? How can we set something up like a little machine, cast it out on the internet, and know that it will grow exponentially while still maintaining a high level of participant, user population over time. And we think we have the answer with Pursuance.
There we go. So you mentioned having it being something that you've been thinking about a couple of years ago and trying to sort of summarize and come up with ideas. Do you mind talking about your time while you were sentenced, and did it all overlap with that? Was it sort of post having been put into the prison system, I suppose? I'm trying to come up with the right term for it, because obviously your sentencing was overturned in the end, and you managed to kind of clear your name effectively. But I assume that time was one of the times you had the most time to think about how you were going to improve upon your activism.
Yeah, well, so Project PM, before it was a crowdsourced investigation into the intelligence contracting industry with the goal of producing this expanding wiki and helping journalists. Before it was originally intended to create a primitive version of this same system, the same Pursuance system. We wouldn't call that back then. And then, of course, so that's what I was working on in 2010. We had a lot of great volunteers. And then Anonymous sort of, to me, seemed like a more immediate avenue. And the Tunisian Revolution happened. And so I got involved in that. A lot of original participants were uncomfortable with this level of banditry and sort of lawlessness. And so they kind of took a hike. So I got distracted from that for a while. And then upon being sent to prison, where I spent 4 years, obviously had an opportunity to think and plan and kind of refine that original methodology, and original framework. And when I got out, I was in a good position to, get input from others, bring on a team of people who could really flesh this out with me and improve it and execute it. In fact, since I'm not a programmer, have no real technical background. So certainly this was something that, and of course I had learned between the time when I started Project PM in 2009 and the time I went to prison in 2012, I had spent a couple of years, obviously, with Anonymous, with some of these other groups, looking at telecomics, all of these different arrays of people coming together, using the internet as a vector to affect change. And so I had gotten an opportunity not just to see the broad principles of organization, not just to, think about the internet as a whole, but also to see the really mundane ways in which why things work, why things don't work, who gets in a fight, why do they get in fights, what happens then, et cetera, et cetera. So those are things I would not have known. And it's all very new, of course. It's a new discipline, this kind of thing, in a way. And so I was now better equipped to really make this work. Thanks.
That's quite fascinating, because it's almost like you went through a sort of prototyping process. I hadn't realized that your kind of notion for what Pursuance would become had started that long before, actually. And so the notion that kind of Project PM and a couple of other projects that you were working on pre-Anonymous were kind of these prototypes or these iterations that you then built on, and then with Anonymous you got to put some of those principles to the test and kind of practice exactly. and see whether they were watertight.
We're taking a trip to the kitchen to get coffee. Don't mind me. No, absolutely. These are things that I was very lucky to be able to see and participate in. And obviously, that's knowledge that's when you're trying to do what I'm doing, it's invaluable. I mean, but even being in prison and learning about prison gangs, that informed, provided me with insights again, also on how do people respond to these particular pressures, how do they respond to these difficulties, these security risks, and how over the years in this sort of very compressed environments, this very this sort of pressure cooker of innovation, how have they dealt with these things? How have they dealt with constant surveillance by prison security? People who are live in prisons, obviously, they're facing these issues before the general public. So that was another very well-timed, valuable experience for me that's sort of informed some of what Project Pursuance will do. Wow.
That's an incredible positive to take out of what could be a very oppressive, is a very oppressive situation. So I suppose in some sense, that's a bit of a coping mechanism, being able to take all of the things that you can learn from that and recognize them as quickly as possible.
Well, unless you go to prison as a political prisoner and are widely identified as doing so, it's going to be very hard to do the kind of things that I want to do in life. So I really I can't say I minded that much. It all kind of worked out for me. And frankly, the stuff that we had done, the research into these intelligence contracting deals, they did get attention back then. They did get, there was some coverage. There's journalists that understood what we were doing. But it wasn't really until the DOJ started going after me in this very ludicrous and suspicious fashion that the press at large realized, oh yeah, this was important stuff, clearly, because I was facing 105 years worth of charges. And so they made the case for my work and our research in a way that I never could. The DOJ did.
Yeah. Cool. So the next thing I wanted to sort of touch on was things that you and I talked about a little bit already, where the overlaps between the fictional world of Off-Grid and all of the things that you touch on with your work are. Because I think you and I have a fairly innate understanding of that, but potentially, certainly the games audience don't necessarily know enough about Pursuance and your background. And probably the Pursuance audience, which I would assume we have a few of those folks out there watching too, don't necessarily understand that much about the game. So I was going to give a kind of top-down summary of it, and then I thought we could kind of dig into some of those themes.
Well.
So Off-Grid is set in a kind of very near future, almost just tomorrow type world, where the internet as we know it has just had too much bad regulation pushed through, whether it's SOPA and PIPA having made it through back in 2012, 2013, or as Theresa May has been pushing in the last year or two, the Digital Economies Bill, which in the UK is essentially the equivalent of outlawing encryption unless GCHQ have given it a tick on the box that they know how to backdoor or break into it. So the notion in Off-Grid is we set up a universe where kind of free communication and the kind of things that you work on frequently in order to do what you do have kind of been a little bit further suppressed than they already are. And the game is set up around a kind of technophobe dad whose hacktivist daughter gets bundled away over breakfast. And you have to kind of unveil the conspiracy of where different corporations and government departments have collaborated in order to silence hackers and people poking at why the internet has all of a sudden had this chill factor applied to it. So that's the kind of the setup for it. And then on top of it, it's a moddable game. So we're hoping that people will tell their own stories about data privacy or mass surveillance or these kinds of themes and expand upon it. So yeah, I was hoping we could kind of try and dig into what elements of that interest you, and where you and I kind of getting to chat, and Steve and I also, the software developer that you mentioned earlier, who you work with very closely on the Pursuance Project, where we kind of came and collided together. I guess our kind of closest link is the fact that you worked very closely, and not necessarily knowing them by anything other than their handles at the time, but with some close friends of mine in Jake Davis, Mustafa Al-Bassam, and Darren Martin when they were part of lulsec/Anonymous and dealing with the HB Gary stuff. So that obviously influences kind of where we both come from in terms of our interests and our experiences. But yeah, how do you see Off-Grid, and what's your impression, and how did you come to find it interesting?
Well, obviously, there's a couple of sort of legitimate policy reasons to find it interesting, but as a gamer also, anything involving procedural generation, I'm very interested in. You know, I'm a big fan of Dwarf Fortress, Caves of Cud, anything whereby we're now allowing, we're taking advantage of the technology we have to create, emergent behavior, emergent sort of literature, emergent stories. And that's, to me, that's a very important aspect of gaming that has a real future. I also happen to think, and I've discussed this, I think you and I have discussed this a bit, I've also been talking to this AI developer in Dallas about this, that there something could be done with procedural generation vis-a-vis designing sort of non-intuitive human networks, like Pursuances, for instance. And that's something that I don't know enough about these disciplines to really go into, but apparently it's a viable idea because people who do know about it seem to be interested in the idea at least. But anyway, but the game itself, obviously, we need vectors by which to bring into public consciousness these things that so many people have gone to prison or gone into exile in order to expose. And so this games, just like films before them, and radio and everything else, are potential vectors for this kind of information that might be boring or whatever otherwise. So presenting a game in which you yourself are seeing the consequences of these things, in which you yourself as a character or as a player are experiencing, for instance, or you're brushing up against persona management, or these kinds of very hard to get your hands around kind of nefarious sort of amorphous propaganda and disinformation networks and methodologies. That's something that can go wonders towards attracting attention to this issue and getting people, at least informed about them, which is always the first step.
Can you give a top-down sort of summary of persona management for layman viewers?
So this is the thing that we came across that was in these emails. It wasn't really a part and parcel of the Team Themis conspiracy that we originally uncovered, which was the one that got the most coverage. It was something that came out a few weeks later. And it's very important to note that this was discovered not by one of the journalists who all had access to these emails. It was discovered by a civilian researcher at Daily Kos, which is a left-wing blog. In the absence of really sustained, serious, professionalism among the press, civilian researchers have to step in and do crowdsourcing and pick up the pieces because the press, it's like operates like a 3-year-old child. It has this attention span that's very easy to manipulate, very easy to get around. Anyway, so persona management, as we originally uncovered, and there are some interesting patents about this. One done by IBM and several military inventors that we have up on our website. A few other, emails, governments issued requests for proposals. So what we know about it is that it is a methodology by which a single person can more easily operate some huge number of fake online profiles. This is done through software, of course, and the extent to which this goes, for instance, well, actually, let me start with a solid example of what Syncom does. This is our first knowledge of this came from the Syncom proposal. Well, they were asking these existing intelligence contracting firms. They were asking firms like HB Gary, Intrepid, Cubic, whatever, to develop their specifications. Their specifications were: we want software that a single soldier can use at a base and easily control over time 15 people, fake people that we make up, that are virtually indistinguishable from real people, that could withstand a great deal of scrutiny, that can communicate over time if you have 15 people on the internet, on social media, you're talking to hundreds of people in that process. And so keeping all that straight would be difficult, which is why most people don't have 100 sock puppets. But the software facilitates that. It keeps track of things. It also translates things automatically. If necessary, it can maintain a certain cadence, which from our understanding, one can type in, "Hey, how you doing?" Into their deal, and it would, instead of typing out that, it would maintain whatever profiles they have for that persona. So it would come out on the other end like, "Yo, what's up?" if that was the appropriate response for that character. Oh, really? And so rather than having to keep track of all, it makes something that's already dangerous, which is the ability to infiltrate and to manufacture events, fake people, etc. It turns it into a mechanized, mass operation in a way that is particularly frightening because, again, it strikes at information. These things are only used by definition for misinforming people, for setting up people that don't exist, manufacturing incidents if necessary, infiltrating groups, and the problem with being able to, again, manufacture some incident online, our media, our press, almost by definition, is very event driven. And so the things that supposedly happen, that can spur on a lot of attention in ways that policy or gradual development don't. So, if a shooting occurs, suddenly all those issues around shooting suddenly get, a lot of attention all of a sudden. That's when the press starts doing feature articles on whatever, anti-Semitism, blah, blah. If a pit bull mauls a baby, well, that's when they start talking about pit bulls and other issues. So the ability to be able to manufacture events it is very, very dangerous in this kind of society. And so something about persona management, right now, from what we've seen as of the state of the art, 2010, 2011, was from the portions we saw were fairly primitive compared to what we can imagine happening. Because we can easily imagine a system whereby software using basic AI, the sort we have now, can over time manufacture its own personalities, its own fake personalities, proliferate them across the internet, and a few of them can sort of screw up. A few of them could be like unbelievable, but that doesn't necessarily detract from the larger campaign. So if you have 80,000 fake people operated in part by human operators with some input here and there, but increasingly by computers, you've got a situation in which, we can't sit here and really think of all the possibilities easily. I've been thinking about them for years myself, but we can never imagine what specialists can come up with to do with these things at intelligence agencies, at just across the world. So that's something that to me, that's one of my main focuses is persona management. It's a thing that came out of these emails. Rather than facial recognition, rather than whatever else, that's the thing that scares me by far the most.
And so, I mean, thinking to Silicon Valley's answer to that is usually from Facebook saying, well, every individual should try and be as absolutely transparent as possible. And the way to get around this kind of generation of fake news by sock puppets and bots is to make sure that each individual is verified online by their entire network of friends, and you kind of end up in a weird sort of self-reporting Stasi-like know thy neighbor situation. So there's sort of a catch-22 to how the current solutions are proposed. Have you heard anything more interesting as to how we might go forward, or is it more just a curious interest that you're?
Well, unfortunately, there's very little discussion about it, even among specialists. I mean, there's just not. I don't think there's even that. You wouldn't even go to like a specialist, convention somewhere or conference and expect to hear a talk on it. It's still such a minor side issue. It came up again a few weeks ago when the New York Times reported that the Trump campaign had approached this Israeli firm, I forget the name of it, for something like persona management, and they sent back a very detailed proposal of what that would consist of. So this is the first time we've seen it again, to my knowledge, since 2011. But so we know as A, it's still out there. B, political campaigns are already thinking about using it. C, there's more and more firms out there offering it. D, we can assume from that there are people who have been using it in the interim, that there is a market still. And E, that it haven't been caught yet again. So that tells us this is not something we can expect to be able to detect. And it's only going to get easier and easier on their side. So unless we happen to develop some counter AI that specializes in detecting these things, we're going to have a cat and mouse game either way. So the only solution to this, from my standpoint, is that when people are discovered to be developing persona management or asking for it, they should be made to face consequences. And there's no laws in place that would stop that right now. But I mean, that's why we need what we call enhanced activism. These kind of things should be considered like mass weapons of mass destruction. Those involved, should be isolated. They should be subject to as much pressure as can be made to bear on them. It's that serious.
Does it become a bit of a kind of similar to the kind of nuclear disarmament argument, in that it's nation states that tend to wield these powers at the moment, and they can argue, well, Russia or China or whoever our given enemy at the time is supposedly, they're not going to listen to this global regulation on this thing, so we have to maintain the power to manipulate personas in order to be able to counteract it or whatever else.
Right. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought it in those terms, but obviously, bringing up weapons of mass destruction obviously invites that analogy, and I think there's something to. I think there's some overlap there. It is different because I'm not sure that personas, two sets of persona management tools, can be sort of deterrents to each other. I'm not sure that the idea that if we use persona management against them, they're going to use it against us. As in with the nuclear question. It doesn't quite work that way, because first of all, when a nuke hits you, a nuke has hit you. When someone's using persona management, you don't necessarily know, and you certainly don't know where it's coming from. And so the dynamic here is one where there is a similarity to nuclear proliferation, in so much as that 1945 one nation had atom bombs, in 1948 two of them had it, so on and so forth, until the present day. And now we have for the last several decades also had bring in the factor of independent actors who are able to buy nukes, blah, blah. With persona management, there is you don't need to get uranium. You don't need to have access to really advanced technology, uranium, blah, blah. It's really not that advanced in the sense of it's not something that requires a great deal of R&D. It's just you have to think of it. And it's been thought of, and it's been developed. And so being software, like everything else, it's going to proliferate. It's being information, essentially. You can't put it back in the box. So that's why we will, in my view, within a few decades, this is going to be pretty much everywhere. It's going to be used by every bad actor in the world, from private to public state, and and that's a situation that it's hard to as if we needed more difficulties in assessing what is correct and what's not, and what's important is not. This is going to make it that much harder. And it's the kind of thing that it's only used by people who are, by definition, disinformation enthusiasts, people who are not interested in transparency or informed consent. And so that's why, again, I reiterate that this is something that has to be dealt with, frankly, viciously when it's found out. And it has not been. In fact, on the contrary, those using it have gotten sort of the aid and cover of the governments and that are ordering it. Just like with so many other things, they won't realize what a problem this is until it comes back to bite them. Now, one would have thought that in 2016, with the Russians and other groups now using as a matter of practice, huge numbers of just very simple bots on Twitter and all that to spread disinformation, confuse things, change the focus on them. You would think that at this point, here's another opportunity for, the major journalists, the major office holders to say, hey, this is a phenomenon that we need to get our hands around right now. I mean, we don't have to wait for the time when it becomes a major factor. It's already a major factor. But the situation is so bad. It's just so primitive, the way in which we assess information, the way in which the press, allots attention, that it just makes the situation so much worse. It just means that they have all these opportunities, even if they get caught again, even when it comes up again, as it did in this New York Times article that got very little attention after it came out. I mean, it had no follow-up, no articles in the Atlantic, think pieces, 10,000 words on the background of this, nothing. It's just going to take a lot of additional efforts on the part of informed citizens to get this to a point where we do talk about it, where we do start solving it.
Well, hopefully, Off-Grid being a game that can deal with some of those issues and things that you discover in places in the plot or the story can open up the door to that. Certainly on a very low level. I mean, like the way we sort of see Off-Grid is it's sort of a gateway to people's interest in this stuff in some sense. Like an onboarding, giving people ideas around how networks work, how surveillance works, but also then how the policies that affect them as individuals in that fiction occur as well. So it'll be interesting to see, like, as we go forward and collaborate on the kind of things that you're interested in and build the Off-Grid universe in that direction, what we can tackle, I suppose.
Absolutely. And, as you and I have discussed already, one possibility is including a lot of the text from the old Pursuance Project PM website in the game, in documents, and all that kind of thing, so that, as people are exploring this world, they come across, short sections on Palantir, on, on just various methodologies and that kind of thing. It's obviously works better for software methodologies than it does for individual companies, because, then we have to start saying, oh, so what's Palantir like in 2023? That might be interesting. That might be interesting to say.
That might be quite tricky thought experiment.
Extraterritoriality, has an orbital station, and it's, might be too on the mark. It might be too depressing. But anyway, yeah. So there's obviously a great deal that you can do that makes it just not just something you can read, but also something you interact with, something that really resonates. I mean, increasingly people they understand a lot of the world through through film, through books, and through games, and so it's entirely appropriate to use that as a method of not just explaining oh, here's what persona management is, but having a character have to deal with it, have to sort out. Well, I have to figure out did this event really happen? How can I tell? At least is this person I'm talking to real, or is it the Turing test, of course, is now going to come up more and more in a practical matter, because as it already has, whenever you have a Facebook account or something else, you get approached by where you're not sure quite yet are bots. We know that they've been increasingly sophisticated, still very simple AI, but good enough, for government work, kind of, text bots, chat bots, essentially, that are used in all kinds of commercial ways. And so these are all things that you create a whole world with what's centering around that, where that's emphasized, where it's all kind of coming at you at once, and you're seeing all the implications. I think, aside from just informing people about individual, discrete issues, I think it will absolutely help to set people thinking about, what does this all add up to, and what does that mean, and what should be done about it. I think that's why a game, I think, is a great environment for this. Yeah,
perfect. And I suppose this is a good time to announce that you and I talked about putting you in as a character that people can ask some of these questions as well. So in Off-Grid, people may have seen over Twitter over the last few days, and in a few other places, a couple of actually indie games news websites have written about it as well, that we're going to have interesting characters from the worlds of activism and hacker culture feature as characters that the player can meet in the game world and exchange a PGP key with, essentially, or essentially some kind of asynchronous key that gives them encrypted chat. and then those chats are things that the player can follow up with, whereby that individual has written them. So we'll have a Barrett Brown character that players can meet in a certain place and have an exchange with, and then be able to message the fictional Barrett Brown and have a couple of pre-written conversations that hopefully open up some of these discussions and give them clues as to what kind of documents would be interesting for them to search for in the off-grid game world.
Isn't it possible to create chatbots now very simply just by putting in a whole bunch of text that a person has written? Didn't I read something about this similar?
Basically having an AI analyze how someone talks and then replicates it within a chatbot. Is that what you mean?
Isn't that being done more commercially is a more casual sense? Like is that something that can be done? I would like to have a chatbot that just gives you just
did it for you. Yeah, that would be perfect. I think our software team's
that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's not something that I actually have a lot of experience with. In fact, the commercial application of chatbots now is so widespread that you see very small kind of mom and pop businesses using third-party plug-in chatbots for responding to inquiries on their website and, oh, hey, how you doing? Are you lost? And helping people through the user experience of a given website and stuff like that. So it wouldn't surprise me if then someone had written a way of analyzing a voice or a text style or how many times you misspell something and replicating it. Certainly. I've got another question that I wanted to dig into with you, Barrett. Sort of from the perspective of off-grid and the difficulty in portraying subjects in a sensitive way when they've been through something like you have with the prison system and this, that, and the other, and whether you've got any thoughts or feelings on that front, and how, especially in games, seeing as you're quite an avid gamer, how to avoid mechanics overshadowing content in some sense if it's not done carefully. So I guess, yeah, chatting about how you feel about games and media exploring those kinds of issues and whether you've got examples where you think it's been done poorly, that kind of thing.
Well, there's an interesting game called, I'm sure you're aware of, called The Escapists.
Okay, yeah.
It's on Steam. It's on Switch. Anyway, and you're in a prison. There's different scenarios. But you're mostly in a pretty standard U.S. prison, and it's kind of cartoony and kind of funny. Everybody's saying amazing things and all that. But the dynamics, the feel of it is pretty accurate. I mean, you have these routines, you have the counts, you have to go back to your cell at certain times, and so it does kind of give you some feel of being in a prison. You have to like make shivs and stuff. You can trade items and you can hit people and just whatever. So I think it's a fun game. I played it with Peter Stern, who's at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Him and I play a lot of games together.
He was Telecomics at one point.
Was he? Oh, I had no idea.
Oh no, that's Peter Fane.
Yes, I remember him actually. So that's a name.
That's interesting to hear. Have you played Prison Architect by Introvert?
No, I haven't played it though.
That's another one I think would probably interest you.
Dwarf Fortress is an architect to me.
What's that?
Dwarf Fortress to me is Prison Architect. I can create all kinds of horrible things in Dwarf Fortress without having to get in a whole.
That's true. Well, in Prison Architect, you can go the other way and you can try and make the most amenable prison possible.
Yeah, that wouldn't be as fun. I mean,
fair enough.
But yeah, I mean, I don't have strong feelings really about it's not something that I care one way or the other about. It's not something that I'm like. It's an emotional thing for me or like that. I don't think and I'm pretty sure that's the case for a lot of inmates. I mean, inmates I know a lot of guys, obviously, because I was in prison, but a lot of people who did time, and we like to watch those prison documentaries. We like to see what other prisoners, we like to see people, dealing with the same issues and blah, blah, and how things happen here and like blah, blah. And, that's fun for us. I don't really know anybody who I think is the kind of people who do all the time in American prisons tend not to be the safe space sort of people. That's by definition. So, so So I mean, it's not something I've thought much about. It's not, you know, when I play a game like, you know, like Escapist 2, I'm not really thinking, you know, other than like, oh, this is interesting. You know, this is kind of like what Prison was like in some ways. So that's kind of different than blah blah. You know, it's just not something that I care one way or the other about. Now, in terms of dynamics, you asked earlier about making sure that the mechanisms don't overshadow something or other. You know, that's something else I don't really know. To me, the mechanics are always an important part of the game. You know, there's what we call min-maxers. I think that's how you pronounce it. You know, where, you know, there's people who are very interested in the mechanics. You know, and as opposed to the story. I don't particularly play games that don't have what I think to be interesting and nuanced and kind of mechanics. Like I prefer to play Final Fantasy Tactics or, you know, XCOM or whatever, rather than like a very story-driven game where you don't have many options. I like emergent gameplay. And that, in a primitive sense, comes out when you have, you know, customizable characters and randomly generated enemies, and you start to have that in a very primitive sense. And then, you know, as you approach, you know, Dwarf Fortress level or Caves of Cud, you start to, you know, that's what I'm out for as someone who's always been interested in games. I'm out for the ability to see that something that's been created, you know, not with the tropes and the sort of the narrative funneling down of a human mind, but rather, you know, sort of a
system that expands upon it and generates something.
Exactly. So I mean, that's why it's interesting. I'm happier when I come across a person in Dwarf Fortress who happens to have an interesting backstory that was generated by virtue of, you know, cause and effect, rather than somebody thinks that elven women should be like this, blah blah. You know, I prefer the creations of nature, you might say, than to, you know, the sort of the limited, you know, fictional limited ability of humans to conceive of nature.
It's sort of a scarcity thing in some sense as well, right? Because when you're in a procedurally generated world, or you meet a procedurally generated character, you know that is likely to be an encounter that not many other people will have, and so it feels that much more special. And so in off-grid, I mean, the procedural generation is much more limited, but it revolves around the way that the data is generated by the characters. So they each have personalities, or in fact profiles. Each AI or NPC in off-grid has a very long list, almost like if you doxed someone, but their docs had been kind of put together off the back of Prism type access to their background. So, you know, you've got people's favorite aunt, their favorite color, their dog's name, their anniversary date, their birthday, their social security, whether they like coffee, whether they like dancing, what their favorite music is. And in off-grid, that long kind of profile is what generates random text messages and tweets and whatever else that the character leaves around, and what devices they will interact with. So the procedural generation is more around the behavior of the characters rather than the characters themselves. They're still kind of written. Someone has to write those profiles, although eventually they could be procedurally generated. But then the data that you come across can be quite unique and quite interesting from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, that hits the same notes to me. I mean, it hits the same, you know, that to me is I consider that to be a sufficiently interesting dynamic right there, without them having to be created. Now, so for instance, this Divinity 2 campaign that I'm running for our donors, some of our Kickstarter donors, you know, I've been creating this big, increasingly vast, complex, you know, sort of background world on this online role playing game that I then oversee as a game master. And so in the course of doing that, I have dice, and I roll off this list of attributes that I've written down. And so, you know, this character that's a tavern keeper, instead of being, oh, I'm a grizzled tavern keeper, it ends up being a surprising combination of things. And then if I develop a procedural connection, I say, well, this person is going to be connected to the next person I roll about. Then I have a lady of some prominence connected in some way to some housekeeper in another village. Now I'm challenged to decide what that connection could be. And so the world becomes more and more interesting over time than it would be, because again, we are trope. We are filled with tropes. We're filled with, you know, ways that things should make sense. And so we're not able to really approximate, the complexities of the real world. And even aside from that, we're not able to create surprising new scenarios. And so I use a combination of procedural generation and, as everyone does, really. I mean, nothing is totally procedurally generated, but
the rolling of the dice in that instance almost it kind of forces you out of taking the lazy decision as a writer to do what you'd prefer the character to be or whatever else. It kind of forces you into, oh well, I didn't want this person to be a brute. I was thinking they'd be handsome and charming, and now how do I make sure I shape this character into someone that someone's going to want to play as? How do I take that attribute that's negative and make it something that someone's going to enjoy?
This may be apocryphal, but there's an old story about a writer, probably a mystery writer or something, or a pulp writer who, when he got probably about in the 50s or so, when he got stuck in his narrative, he had a dartboard, and that dartboard was divided into surprise arrival, or like sung from the past, or death, or some of the things. And he just throw the dart. And so again, he saved himself. He rescued himself from A, his own tropes, and B, having to figure out, it could be liberating to have a structure laid out for you as someone who's writing. And so, it can also lead to places that a writer could not otherwise get to, not just a writer, but anyone creating fiction. And so that's kind of what this is all based on. That's a sort of the early procedural generation of fiction, of narrative. And this is just all of everything else is just a more advanced version of that. Just like persona management is merely a vastly more advanced version of a sock puppet, or of a child on the other side of the wall talking in a fake voice, pretending to be somebody else. It's all the same thing. It's really a matter of extent. And once you get to a certain point, persona management, the ability to create and deploy huge numbers of extremely realistic people, that's why it's also kind of hard for people to take seriously, because they know what sock puppets are. Like, oh, sock puppets, that's people, that's silly troll stuff. Well, it's those associations make it hard for people to understand how serious this can be, because unrelated
to that scope.
Yeah, and just like games were not taken seriously by a lot of people until the Japanese started making huge amounts of money off them and playing Final Fantasy scores in their symphony halls. And the military, of course, started using. There's actually a very interesting convergence between the U.S. intelligence community and the game industry that we learned about. Me and Topiary and some of the other characters in your game there that we were sort of informed of back in 2011 by this sort of interesting fellow who used to work in the intelligence community, and there was a sort of unsung and very telling convergence there, where there was a lot of developers who were involved in the U.S. intelligence community. One of them was the fellow who first licensed Tetris for the U.S. from the Russians. He was I forget his name now, but easily discovered. But anyway, so games, games are serious. The ability to fake things are serious. Narrative is serious. Fiction is serious. All these things have not just artistic, profound applications. They are also potentially weaponized, every single one of them. And to the extent that this game helps to make that clear, helps to sort of help that come through, that anything developed enough, refined enough, becomes dangerous, becomes important, then the game will have, in that sense, I think, done a great service to the people who play it. I think he died.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, it's I gave a talk actually a couple of more recently game conferences. The notion that off-grid could be used as a tool for disclosing zero. So actually, in the same way as you at times to get journalists, other main to pick up on. A lot of security research is very hard to get websites to vulnerabilities that they've found, whether that's in an electric car or a web app. And so I presented a similar talk where I took electric cars and the app with them, and made it as a mod in the game that people could easily do. And so I think the hope would be that we can take some of the very complex subjects and try and break them down into something that people game partial grip on, then go on and learn more about.
Cut out there for a second. But anyway, I heard most of that. But yeah, making these taking these complex subjects is actually a little bit easier in these cases, because in most of these instances, whether we're talking about persona management or whatever else, there are pretty simple analogs that can be used, to explain it. Again, persona management is mass sock puppetry. People understand what sock puppets are; they can conceive of it pretty easily. And I think the same is. Well, I do know that it's a lot of. I have seen in the course of people explaining things to me about technology, about security that I don't know. I've learned. I've noticed that there are a lot of great analogies out there so that these issues don't need to be complex. They can be presented, in these various formats. I'm not able to see or hear you at the time, so I'm just going to stand here and. Oh, now you're gone. So just me here now. Well, welcome to the Barrett Brown Off the Grid live stream. I'm Barrett Brown, your host. We're standing here in Victoria, Texas, smoking a cigarette. Get my e-cigarette, can seem to be working, et cetera, et cetera. If anybody has any questions, I guess there's a Q&A thing you can type thing, or you can type in the chat thing. I guess just type in the chat deal, and I will respond to any questions that I get. We'll await our host. He may still be here. He may be talking right now. This live stream thing is just a terrible piece of technology. It's like the worst thing I've ever encountered. Piece of shit. It's put together terribly. Here we have Claire Peters, who's our executive director at Pursuance, asks, what kind of analogies have you found most useful in explaining security issues? That's a question that she would be interested in, because she has to explain these things to me herself. Let me see if I can think of an actual specific. The other thing about when I'm explaining things about security stuff is I do tend to kind of, my mind does kind of wander, because they just don't interest me as such. I guess if you compared an aspect of security or encryption to the way that a Roman senator might, seek to incite a legion against another senator, I guess that might work for me. 0 days, I had no knowledge of. I had no idea what they were for years and years, even though I thought I did. And then it turns out that they were not pieces of software. They were, in fact, here's our host again.
Let's see if I can get this back. Oh, there we go. Barrett, you there?
Yes.
Hey, cool. I'm not sure what happened there. I think I went offline for a period as well. Can you see whether we've got anyone still watching?
It says 15.
Perfect. Well, so I guess I was going to ask a final question actually about RPGs and your kind of interest in tabletop gaming and kind of just a more generally kind of less politically charged question along the lines of like, what was your first kind of experience in tabletop, and were you a Dungeons and Dragons player back in the day? How did you get into tabletop? Because it's something that kind of runs through various things that you still write today and how you talk about things.
Yeah, I always wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid, but none of my friends were interested. So I never got to really play tabletop RPGs very much until I got to prison and suddenly had a captive audience. So
really,
so that's when I said I want these people to send me GURPS, give me the GURPS book. GURPS, of course, is a generic universal role-playing system where it has basic rules that you can sort of work into any snenario. And so I started inventing a Nixon game, Nixon administration, which I wrote about one of my columns from prison.
Yeah, I remember the story.
Duck Colson or whatever. They all have different powers. So that's the great thing about GURPS is that it can be used for any different kind of thing. It can even be used in a productive sense of creating, sort of simple models of situations. And of course, role playing is sometimes used. When we have war games, for instance, which generally involve Iran within the U.S. It's a scenario in which the military or aspects thereof, or State Department or whatever, sort of plays a game essentially where one team is. And I don't know. I'd like to know more about that because I don't really know how that works. Like, does somebody play, the Rafsanjani and someone else play? I have no idea. But
I think they tend to do them as
games are serious. What?
I think they tend to do them in sort of cyber command rooms, and they play as they get young cadets as well to do it as a sort of training or simulation thing ahead of time. But they will have the Navy working completely separately from the Army, completely separately from the Air Force, with their own signals simulations set up, and have to try and communicate what they've found at different times. So, and they then have their mentors or the kind of trainers acting as the bad player at that point. But yeah, it is fascinating, the war game simulations.
It was about 15 years ago or more that the U.S. military put out America's Army, a computer game that was intended to enhance recruitment. Likewise, off grid could essentially be the civic activist equivalent of that, to recruit activists essentially by having a game activist, or which you engage in those issues, which is interesting. Something else I was going to say about the gaming aspect. But no, I didn't play a lot of tabletop games growing up. Moria, all of the roguelike games essentially, back in the early 90s. That was the most easily accessible way to play a complex game if you had a shitty computer. And so so I kind of had Dungeons and Dragons sort of ethos, if you want to call it that, or the structure, that was a part of my childhood. But I also got in some pretty upsetting conflicts in prison over games. There was a dungeon master. He was a black Muslim from D.C., and he was a big DM guy. He said, I used to sell crack and be cool and all that. And he got me 30 years in prison, so now I'm trying to be a nerd, was his ethos anyway. But one time we were playing, and I said, I want to tie this rope from one end of a pit to another end. And he decided that I tied it in some ridiculous way that I obviously did not intend, and insisted that's what I had done. And then I stopped playing with him. I was too upset, and he knows what he did. He knows what he was doing.
And he was just doing it to joke you around.
He was just being, I don't have I've read enough on 4chan's old traditional games board and on Reddit's, just I've seen every once in a while to know there's obviously a lot of potential for drama, potential for friction. And there's certain sort of categories that come up over and over again of what that friction consists of and all that. And that's another sort of thing that does kind of play into pursuance and these building new structures for activism, is because we do the same thing. We look at, where do conflicts arise, how and why? How can we minimize those while still maintaining, the parts that are important? How do we minimize that without, overly burdening people with structures? And the solution, that we've come up with, which perhaps may have some applications in tabletop role-playing community, is, generally to get to, the same thing to do. When you set up a team, we set up a gaming group, you obviously look for certain kind of people. You vet them, just like we do in activism. And then you may have rules, and those rules have to be agreed upon, intended to minimize conflicts. And you have to have the ability to easily expand upon the rules, and to do so in a way that everyone has agreed to, like there's a protocol in place. So just like setting up a government or any kind of other institution, all institutions are essentially the same. All structures are essentially fundamentally the same thing. They are arrangements of people. And so, a state is a certain kind of structure that we imbue with a lot of significance, that we imbue with a lot of majesty, with a lot of, that doesn't necessarily follow. It's not necessarily easily, it's hard to justify in many cases. Sort of states tend to exist with a great deal of unanswered questions, a lot of
sort of vague understandings of what people are and what a state is and what the rights are and what states are used, and democracies, for instance, are oftentimes used to launder bad behavior. They're used to to say, look, we're a group of 100 million people. We have a military. We're going to go do this. Oops, it didn't work. It killed a whole lot of people. Well, we're not responsible, even though we're the citizens. We voted for all these things. We'll just move on to the next thing. It's that kind of thing. If you were doing it in a non-state situation, you would probably feel, oh wait, what did we just do? Do we have the right to do this? Do we have the right to have intelligence agents in all these other countries doing this to other people? That's something that is still not even really challenged much among the mainstream establishment, American or UK British thought. Obviously, the UK has had a lot more experience with the issue because of their colonial history, and so they have probably examined those issues more. They had a long period of decolonization, in which these issues did come up. So, but the U.S. has not really had those same conversations, to that extent, at least not on that same level. I mean, those conversations do occur, but they don't occur among the people who actually have power. So that's why in most elections, in presidential elections, it's not going to come up like, wait, should we have all these bases around? Is that even, that's not even an issue here. It just does not occur to most people outside of sort of fringe candidates that maybe we should start deconstructing these structures. Maybe they're dangerous. Maybe they're counterproductive. Maybe they're immoral. And so anyway, so that again flows into this whole deal is a game, a state, a association of people, a tabletop gaming group, a prison gang. These are all the same thing in a way. They just have different consequences. And they all start out with a certain structure and intent. Someone designs a group, someone creates a federal government, someone creates the CIA, and they may have this very specific intent as what this group is supposed to do, what it is on paper, and how it's supposed to proceed. But the problem is that institutions are made up of people, and people themselves are not even cohesive. People are fractured beings. And so you cannot expect to create a structure and 1,000 years later come back and have it be what you wanted, because regardless of what we're all here supposedly to do, deep down, we're all individually here to do other things. And so that's why the FBI, whether or not people who started the FBI envisioned it doing stuff like COINTELPRO, although they probably did, since the kind of people who started the FBI, it ended up doing that. And that's something that's too important to remember in all facets of life, that we can't personalizing institutions, saying the CIA wants this, or the New York Times wants this, or the Guardian wants this. It's a necessary model to talk like that, but we often risk losing sight of what these organizations actually are and how they function if we imbue them with a personality, with a desire, with a collective grouping.
Because they're not static in that way.
Yes.
Yeah. It's fascinating the kind of micro to macro that you went through there is absolutely fascinating. Sorry, the screams in the background of my small child. There's nothing untoward going on. Taking it from tabletop to what you experienced in prison gangs through governmental structures and how that reflects in Pursuance is quite a good marker for your entire approach to what you're doing with Pursuance. So I think that's a fantastic analogy to have explored. I'm probably getting to the point where I probably ought to go and help with bath time and feeding. We should probably wrap up. But Barrett, it's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for making the time to chat with me today.
Great. Oh, just real quick, because someone asked a couple of questions here. I want to answer them very quickly. What projects are you most excited about kicking off on Pursuance? There's a couple involving police reform, sort of helping people to carry on, expand the work of monitoring the police, showing what they do, making sure that arrests are legal and non-lethal. That's something that Pursuance is kind of made for that kind of thing. I think it'll work very well in that environment. So sort of taking what the knowledge that already exists on how you surveil the cops, what you do when you've had the video, where do you proceed from there? Taking that knowledge, getting knowledgeable people in a position where they can teach others and expand upon their operations in a way that if and you can take that same issue and translate to any other issue, you can kind of see how you can sort of get an idea of what other projects would be worthwhile for Pursuance. Second question is, with prison reform, what does success look like and how can Pursuance help? One of the things Pursuance will be doing, and it's a great example of the kind of things it can do, one of the things that we'll be sort of initiating ourselves as the creators of Pursuance, even though, of course, we're not going to be our role is really to oversee this rather than to micromanage it. But I'll be creating and overseeing a prison reform pursuance that helps journalists file FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests at prisons in their region. Shows them what to look for, how to go about this, what how they're going to try to oppose it, how to get around the sort of the loopholes there, and sort of actively work with journalists, sort of make it easy for them to do these things. When you make it easy for a journalist to report on something, they're much more likely to report on it. Journalists, even if they mean well, even if they're very conscientious, they are harried individuals with very little time. And so having these teams of volunteers available to help them, to crowdsource their research beyond prison reform, every other issue, that's a major part of Pursuance, is building, experimenting with crowdsourced research networks, because we know they work. We know they work even when they're done haphazardly by people like me. And so we can from that extrapolate that a better thought out but still agile system of incorporating volunteers and letting journalists use those volunteers, harness their information, harness their research skills. That's something that can help to turn back the tide when it comes to disinformation, bad journalism, poor media structures. So that's something I'm very excited about. Pro bono lawyers are involved. We have one on the board of directors, and we work with a number of others. And so if you know anybody, any colleagues, institutions, NGOs out there that aren't aware of Pursuance, please send them our direction, pursuanceproject.org. You can read about it there. And there's a number of videos on YouTube sort of explaining other facets of it. And thank you for your questions.
Cool. Yeah, that's another thing that we didn't get the time to touch on, like how you see outcomes from Pursuance taking shape, but the kind of notion that crowdsourced research for journalists and even, I guess, to some degree, writing up of press releases that the laziest of journalists can just turn up to and take the top headline and take the right sound bites from and tell an interesting story with very low effort, right?
Right, exactly, and that's the key part is that we explain to them, like, this is not something, it's experimental, but it's not something to put a lot of time or energy or resources into. You come in, create a Pursuance. There are people here who want to help you, give it a shot, and that's an important part of all of this, because there's a lot of institutions, NGOs, that they're very busy, and they don't have time to, and they don't have the inclination to translate all of their activities into some new network. This is something they can use. They can create a small Pursuance as an extension of their existing activities and use that to collaborate better with other institutions, with other NGOs, individuals, harness their constituents. I'll just leave by noting that the founder of the Pirate Party, Rich Falkridge of Sweden, said something very interesting to someone who was talking to. Person was complaining about his organization. I forgot if it was a company or what. And Rich tells him, your problem is not the people you have working for you. Your problem is all the people out there who want to work for you for free, but you don't let them. And that's an important aspect of the 21st century. The fact that we can now, we do have the ability, theoretically, for anyone in the world to collaborate with anyone else in the world. And that's such an important departure from history and how things are, the structures we're usually dealing with. And as we become better aware of what that means, and as we experiment with what that means, and give people the opportunity to themselves experiment in an environment like Pursuance, whereby this can be easily done, we're going to see extraordinary things happen, this time for good rather than for ill.
And that's kind of one of the unique strengths that that we on the good side of the fence, if you will, have against those bad actors that we've talked about throughout this this live stream, is that, nation states doing not so nice things and corporate intelligence subcontractors also, they have to pay people significant sums to persuade them to come along for the ride and help them get their objectives had. Whereas if you're on the right side of right, and you've got something interesting that excites the imagination, then with a tool like Pursuance, you can harness incredible power for trying to combat those forces.
Absolutely, and that's really the only way forward. Even if it's not Pursuance, the only real way forward is for us to solve this problem of how do you. We know there's people out here who don't like these things, don't like what these states are doing. They're all over the world. They have all the varying techniques. They have varying skills. All of them may know something useful, but there's no easy, secure, scalable vector for them to actually get together and harness that. And when we do solve that problem, suddenly the situation changes. The institutions themselves are not able to, almost by definition, not able to evolve quickly, whereas these structures, these dynamic structures, can run rings around them, and in fact may ultimately have more people to draw upon as time goes on. And so we're going to have, like, a sort of a meta union of 20 million people around the world who are in favor of the open societies, in favor of of evidence-based thinking, in favor of individual rights, in favor of equality. They will suddenly see what power they have, not just in a tagline like "you have the power, the people," blah blah, the things we've been hearing for years. In actual fact, they will have power.
Nice. Are there any last questions in the Q&A while we were talking that you want to address? Has anyone brought anything else up?
I think I got all the questions that I was capable of answering.
Cool. For some reason, my browser has not given me view. It's probably because I've got no script blocking a load of stuff. So I haven't been able to see the chat or Q&A or even whether we've got anyone watching us. So it's been good that you've been keeping an eye on it. Yeah. Well, so to wrap up, have you got anything you'd like to sort of finish on, Barrett? Is there anything you'd like to push people in the direction of, other than obviously going and having a look themselves at pursuanceproject.org?
Yeah, I'm banned from Twitter this week because I called some anti-Soros conspiracy monger a slut, and so I got banned for a week for some reason. So go complain on Twitter. Go to my Twitter account, Barrett Brown _, and go post my comments and say "Free Barrett Brown" from Twitter jail.
Free Barrett Brown from Twitter.
I did 4 years in regular prison. Now I'm in Twitter jail. It's one thing after.
Which is worse? Which is worse?
It's hard to, I'll have to, when my sentence is complete, I'll be able to tell you. But it's only been a couple of days so far. So
there we go. Cool. Well, best of luck getting it sorted and getting back on the 200 or 280 character platform. I almost got that wrong. Yeah, we hope to see you on there again soon. Yeah, again, thank you so much for your time. I hope my audience has found this interesting. I think a lot of people have obviously followed along from the Pursuance side of things, so I hope that those folk have found Off-Grid interesting as well. Yeah, let's try and catch up again sometime in the future and do something similar, and maybe we'll do it while playing a tabletop or a Divinity campaign or something along those lines.
absolutely.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Barrett, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon.
You as well. Adios.
Night.